This is the Adams State University Department of Music podcast. Today's topic is Music of the Americas. I'm Dr. James Doyle, Associate Professor of Music, and today I'm joined by...
I'm Dr. Nick Saenz, Associate Professor of History at Adams State University.
And this podcast is in preparation for a series of performances that our Music of the Americas project ensemble will be embarking on, and we will be giving performances throughout Colorado, focusing on the Front Range of Colorado and culminating in a performance at the Colorado Music Educators Association Conference in Colorado Springs. And so I've invited Dr. Saenz to come in and help us break down what the Music of the Americas actually, what does that mean and what does that look like, and how did the music come about, and what's the history, and how did we get the music that honestly we all listen to and enjoy today really around the world. So we're going to dive in to some of the topics related to the colonization of the Americas, the transatlantic slave trade, and a plethora of other topics.
I think one of the really cool things about doing this at this point in time is that 2019 actually marked the 400th anniversary of slavery in what became the United States. And that might seem like more of a tragedy than something worth celebrating, but this is a significant moment. And I think moments like this warrant kind of a pause to think about the implications for the world in which we live today. So much of what we consider to be American music in many ways derives from the influence of African slaves brought forcibly across the Atlantic and the byproduct of that cultural mixing. So the first slaves in what we tend to think of as colonial America arrived at Jamestown in 1619. For many of our listeners thinking about Colorado in the Southwest, the history of the Black presence goes back even further. So there was famously a survivor of the failed Pamphalo de Narvaez expedition who journeyed across North America with Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca by the name of Estevanico. He's probably the first person of Black ancestry in what is today the American Southwest, part of the story of the early colonization by Europeans of this part of the world. And so this is not something that is unique to the eastern coast of North America and the United States, but I think this is ultimately a story with a connection very much to the part of the world in which Adams State is and Colorado and the communities that will be engaging most directly with the Music of the Americas project. I think also thinking about what we're looking at here, what constitutes America. In the United States, we often think about America as the United States. But in fact, the concept of America is something that really is all of the Western Hemisphere. It stretches from the Arctic all the way down to the Antarctic. We're going to be focusing kind of on the middle. The Caribbean is kind of going to be the epicenter of our conversation today. But in thinking about what the Music of the Americas is, we're not looking just at the United States, but we're looking at the United States in a much larger context, really a hemispheric context, and the implications for all of these cultures in this part of the world that have merged together.
So again, to put everything into context, the music that we'll be performing this academic semester, spring of 2020, we're focusing on the Brazilian Samba, the steel pan music of the island nation of Trinidad and Tobago. And then in the middle of the production show that we're doing, we're going to perform a piece known as Pan Logo. It's a dance and kind of a celebratory work of the Ga people in the Accra region of Ghana in West Africa. And so we've taken the gili, which is a balafone of Ghana. It's used primarily in that region, and the drumming, and then actually the students are dancing as well, and so they're doing some traditional choreography that's often done with that. We'll then follow that by performing a Bessie Smith, the Empress of the Blues, a blues number that she recorded in 1926 with Louis Armstrong. And then we'll get into what is our salsa band set. So we'll do a Frankie Ruiz tune, we'll do a Pancho Sanchez tune, we'll do a piece that like Kimbara, which is one of the standards in the repertoire, and then we'll end that set with the band that inspired me to put together this particular project, the band Ozomatli. So it's a Los Angeles-based band, and they're known for their fusion of Latin music and funk and hip hop and just a variety of things. They're also politically active and have brought a lot of attention to immigrant issues, and they tend to raise a lot of money and put their music out there in a way that benefits the communities that happen to enjoy their music as well. And then we'll close the concert and on this tour with a New Orleans brass band second line, which I think when having lived in Louisiana, when I think about my time there or when I go back to visit New Orleans, the thing that comes to mind is always that parade. It's always that brass band that you see. And so that's how we're going to actually close out our concert. So that's the music that we're focusing on here. And as Dr. Saenz said earlier, really all this music has a connection to the Caribbean. You can really honestly think of New Orleans as really a Caribbean city as well.
It's a pretty fun lineup, having had a chance to listen to it once already. Apart from just being kind of an energetic, exciting production, one of the things I like about this from sort of more historical angle is you really see the legacy of that African presence I was talking about a moment ago. These pieces, although somewhat traditional in the sense of being westernized and being able to be performed consistently in the same way, grow out of African and other cultures and their traditions of rhythm. There's elements of call and response, certainly the drumming we see, and elements of the vocal parts with the singing. You see some of that continuity coming from the distant past playing into groups who are as contemporary as Ozomatli. That's a really cool accomplishment to think about how all of these peoples and all of this history sort of comes together represented in musical form.
So as we put together this program, of course, I bought some of the charts that we have prepared, but a lot of the music that we prepared, and even when we have charts, a lot of what we've done is sort of learned in the oral tradition. So we would listen to recordings, or we would have someone a guest come in or go from experience that I have and learn the music in that rote style. Music scoring really is a Western concept, and a lot of the music that would have been passed along and developed over the centuries was music that was passed along and really recreations that are really they live and breathe and evolve. So I think that's important. Of course, with the colonial with the colonial powers, with France and England, the Dutch. You also have the Spanish, of course, the Spanish and really Spanish. Music and culture is pretty diverse in and of itself due to the history of Spain. So there's really a lot of the Western concepts of music, the really like French opera, all those things really permeated New Orleans and other regions throughout the Caribbean and into South America. And you get this blend where composers, they take the traditional forms and convert them into a language that then can be shared and get passed along. And so we're doing our own take on some of these pieces based off of recordings and the sheet music, and then just what we feel makes sense for our ensemble.
So what I'm hearing kind of from the perspective of being someone listening to the music is that on the one hand we have a musical tradition or a set of traditions here with very deep roots that predate really the arrival of Europeans trying to standardize and institutionalize in some sense how these pieces were performed. But then also, because they're recorded, that allows for different performers to reproduce them in larger settings all the way up into the present, but at the same time kind of retaining the original improvisational dimension that for a performer, I imagine, is really enjoyable and kind of rewarding, right? Because you get to add your individual stamp to the piece in a way that kind of from like a more classical European perspective, you don't get to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And that ability to have that freedom and to know what the roots are, but then to figure out the direction that you want to go is really significant. And another thing that I really appreciate about the music we're playing is all this music was really created for the people by the people. When we think about like in Trinidad and Tobago, which we'll talk about here in a minute, the music that came about was that eventually led to the development of the steel pan ensemble. It started with drumming and found instruments by the lower classes and emancipated slaves, and it honestly it was a pushback. And the calypso was a political music of political statements, and it was a pushback against like the ruling class. And so this music has a bit of edge to it, and has again that attempt to strive for freedom through music and individuality, and not being oppressed by the Western concepts. And certainly when we look at it from a musical standpoint, and from an educational standpoint here at Adams State University, we think that's important as for our students to have that understanding. What's the background of this music, and then how can you make it your own, because that's what it was intended to be.
So put another way, we're not looking at elite music necessarily, but this is really music of the people, from the sort of common strata of the people that were the true settlers and colonizers and institution makers of the time.
Absolutely.
So kind of continuing from that idea, we're looking at the people that in some sense actually make the Americas as this part of the world exists today. So often when we talk about the history, unfortunately we focus on a lot of the European colonizers, but part of this story is the indigenous people who are conquered, the Africans, again, who are forcibly brought over against their will, who are very much a part of building the Americas. This is a very old history. It's from an American perspective when we think about what we sort of learn in high school, and even before that. When we think about the history of slavery, we often think about these institutions from sort of a British perspective, focusing a lot on the southern United States. But this is a story that is much older than that. The colonies that exist in what is today the United States really are built upon a precedent that is set by the Spanish and by the Portuguese. I have a quote here from Felipe Fernandez Armesto, who writes, "From Virginia southward, English North American colonies naturally resembled those already exploited in Mesoamerica and South America by Spanish, Dutch, and Portuguese investors. The first English-run sugar industry in Barbados was directly copied from the Dutch enterprise in Pernambuco with Dutch support." So the English are building something that had already been in place in other parts of the Americas for a long time. What we look at with sort of the U.S. dimension here, at some level, is kind of a later story of a much longer narrative that begins centuries before that in other parts of the Americas.
So as I was looking into this, putting together this project, I learned so much that I somehow missed in my own studies about the history of the slave trade. And as you mentioned, I definitely my knowledge came from the really that British and that United States of America perspective. But can you tell us more about that history of the slave trade in a bigger context?
Yeah, so I think kind of continuing on that idea that so much of what we think about slavery as Americans is focused around the history of slavery in the South, kind of building towards the importance of making sense of the U.S. Civil War and the role of slavery there. The story of slavery in the Americas is much older, much broader. I was looking at some information from Bernard Balin. There's a variety of statistics out there trying to actually quantify the number of persons who arrived in the Americas. But I think he has some good numbers that are pretty reliable. He suggests that by about 1775, about 5.5 million people had been brought from Africa to the Western Hemisphere. Notably, only about 36% arrived in British America, and islands like Jamaica would have been a big focal point of that slave trade. But another 32% went to Portuguese territory, above all else, what is today Brazil. So Brazil is receiving a large number of Africans. 13% arrived in French territory, most notably the colony of Saint-Domingue, which later on becomes Haiti. And then about 9% to Spanish America, an area stretching both continents. So we have people really being brought from Africa and arriving in the Americas, not just in the U.S. South or what becomes the U.S. South, but really the entire continent, right? So or the entire hemisphere, both continents, North and South America. So this story of African slavery is something that's not unique to the United States. It's something that was very important to the history of Spanish America. I think as Americans, we often overlook that. We tend to think of Latin America as most predominantly influenced by the Spanish, that it's sort of a world apart. But this African presence is as much a part of the culture of Latin America as it is, and say, this sort of how we think about the U.S. South.
So to begin the conversation as it relates to the music that we're playing, we'll begin with the conversation about samba music of Brazil. And there's, when you think about the samba music of Brazil, usually the image that comes to mind immediately is Carnival in Rio de Janeiro, and the really infectious rhythms and the dancing and the parades and the costumes. And it's really it's a multi-billion-dollar industry, the tourism for Brazil. And the history of samba absolutely has its roots immediately back to Africa. In fact, the name is an Angolan term, Samba, meaning the invitation to dance. And so samba, it really is similar to the other musics that we'll talk about. It's sort of a fusion of a lot of different ideas and music from different parts of West and Central Africa. And we find that in different parts of Brazil, you had different meeting points in which you had larger populations of slaves and then eventually freed slaves. And you start to get this blending of different musics and different religious interpretations. And you start to find music that is not sacred in the sense that we think of, the Catholic Church and the history of Western art music, but the idea of playing music in order to pray to a particular god or saint or a deity of some sort that maybe one way or the other was a part of your past, and sometimes also a slight interpretation of Christianity. And we could literally, there are books and dissertations written on this topic, but to kind of keep it in context of what we're doing, the African rhythms that really influence the Brazilian samba come from like the Congo, the Yoruba people, and other areas of West Africa, the countries along the west coast of Africa. So, samba is really about the dance. A lot of the music is in samba, and then as we work our way to the music that was played in Congo Square in New Orleans, it's related to the circle dances and the group dances that would have happened, and still to an extent today in both the Western Hemisphere and in Africa. So in Brazil, for Carnival, it's become a huge competition. They are competitions. You have the samba schools, so different if you think of it from this perspective, it's almost like social clubs, giant schools of drumming and dance and float making and costumes. And we're talking about samba schools of 1,000 plus people. And these competitions take place leading up to Lent. and there's the giant stadiums that these parades march through. It's 100% worth going to YouTube and Googling, or going to YouTube and looking up the Carnival. It's a huge. You can't wrap your mind around it because we don't really have an equivalent in the United States. The American marching band is not an equivalent to Samba, to what happens with Samba Batucada in the Samba schools. And there's so much pride taken in the neighborhoods. And again, usually we're talking about the individuals who are the working class, the lower class, and this music is for the people. And that's one of the things that's very exciting, and people identify with that.
So these schools are literally preparing all year long for this big event, which is really quite spectacular in many ways. This becomes kind of a way in which identities are constructed, right? People spend all year together talking about, trying to outdo the neighboring school and preparing for this. This is an event that kind of, because of Carnival and the religious significance, comes out of the cultural traditions, but takes on to such another scale of significance here because of the role of music. Music really transformed this from something kind of solemn and serious to a spectacle on steroids in some ways that for many is just such a clear marker of Brazilian identity today. Which is really cool to think about the way in which music has defined that identity and still gives salience to the experiences of the people who live in modern Brazil.
So making our way north off the coast of South America, and really the southernmost islands of the Caribbean are the island nation of Trinidad and Tobago, and very unique musical history from there. And to understand how that musical history is so very unique, I think it's important to understand how the Caribbean itself incorporates so many additional peoples and voices. And so, would you mind explaining a little bit how is the Caribbean a bit different from other parts of the Western Hemisphere?
Yeah, so one of the cultural influences that we see in the Caribbean is a South Asian presence that you don't find too many other places, at least not to the same extent as we do in the Caribbean. So by South Asian, I mean Indian, or what we tend to colloquially talk about as Indian today. So after the end of slavery, so the end of the abolition period, the British, by and large, are looking for essentially cheap labor. They now can't own people as property, but they're looking for low-wage workers. And so they bring persons from other parts of their empire, especially to places like the Caribbean, where there is still today a very large South Asian influence. And so we're not talking just about the Spanish or the black presence in the Caribbean, in addition to the older indigenous presence, but now there's also the addition of yet new voices, and the South Asian presence is, I think, a big part of that. Trinidad and Tobago is one of these places where we see that, and you're performing, I think, 3 pieces from that island nation?
We are. So we're doing a transcription of a pop tune by a famous soca singer, songwriter, actor, producer. And then we're doing 2 pieces that are that were written by and then transcribed by others, but written by some of the legends, the Trini legends of steel pan. And to put some of that into context as well, the steel pan, they're literally instruments that developed from 55-gallon drums. But to back up even further, you had the drumming and the found instrument music making that was eventually oppressed and suppressed, I should say. And then what you had were the people who still needed to express themselves musically using cut pieces of bamboo, and they would stomp and stamp these pieces of bamboo and hit them with sticks and play some of the same rhythms that you can think of that would be used in drumming. And then eventually that grew into finding like biscuit tins and like caustic soda containers, so metal containers that were that were hit, and probably by chance, someone figured out that dented metal creates different pitches. And so when you indent metals to different degrees, then you find different pitches. And so slowly this developed into the chromatic steel pans of today. Because we later learned that Trinidad and Tobago is actually a very oil and natural gas rich area, but also significant ports. So you had large naval presence in the islands there, and then you also, like I said, with the oil industry, the 55-gallon drums were plentiful, and so they became. They became the raw materials for this concept that is the steel band. And we are lucky here at Adams State University to have a very robust pan program. And so the pieces, the last two pieces we're playing out of our set of three pan tunes are in the panorama style. And so panorama is similar to Carnival or Mardi Gras in New Orleans, but it's a large festival, a competition of there are pan yards similar to the Samba schools, and so different neighborhoods, and if you think of them as sort of social clubs, they build their pans, they write their own arrangements, or someone from their pan yard writes the arrangements, and then they spend all year, again, practicing these tunes. And they originally, these pans would have been worn around your neck with a strap, but have since been put on the back of trucks, sometimes pushed throughout history. These big bands of hundreds of pans, and the music itself. Again, we're doing two tunes that come from the panorama tradition by two of the greats, Boogsy Sharp and Ray Hallman.
So moving ahead to a little later in the program, there are several features that now bring back that African drumming more clearly. Can you talk about those pieces?
Absolutely. So we actually jump from the music of the Americas to an example of Ghanaian drumming and dance. And what we're after there is we're setting ourselves up for the salsa portion of our program is to talk about a rhythmic timeline that really is used throughout so much music. And that rhythmic timeline is called the Clave. In Samba, there's a Clave pattern. It's sometimes called the Samba Clave, but there's another pattern called Son Clave that gets used in everything from a lot of salsa music to R&B, funk music. It's really probably one of the most pertinent timelines or rhythmic patterns that exists. And then when we think about the drumming culture that comes from West Africa and Central Africa, then what we think of today is the commercial congas, the barrel-shaped drums with a skin head, sometimes a plastic head. What we're seeing there are solid shell. We're seeing stave construction drums that are based off of the solid shell natural skin instruments that would be used throughout the African continent, and tuned with these peg tunings. On this tour, we'll actually have one drum. We have a set of Awe drums, so drums from Ghana, but we're going to actually only use one on this tour. But if you're able to catch our concert, you'll see an example of one of those solid shell natural drums that's tuned with those pegs. But again, the clave rhythm, you hear this particular pattern a lot, and in Pan Logo, that what we think of here in the Americas as son clave is actually used in Pan Logo.
So it sounds like this is probably actually sort of a rhythm that we've heard, even if we've never had a name to apply to it. If we see it in stuff like R&B and funk, it's something you hear on the radio, but you don't necessarily identify. Can you maybe clap out for us what you're talking about here?
Yeah, sure. So son clave, it's either thought of as a 3-2 clave, which I'll clap 3-2. So it has the group of three notes is first, and then the 2-3 clave or 2-3 son clave is literally the same thing. You're just starting on the two sides, so it sounds like this. So you hear that in Pan Logo, and then when we get into the salsa music that developed really in New York City, but of Cuban and Puerto Rican immigrant creation and fusion with jazz and that sort of thing, you hear this rhythm in a lot of the music, and very syncopated music. And usually the syncopated rhythms that happen in the band, it's on the 3 side of the clave. You hear the syncopated on that side, and then the things that are a little more downbeat oriented are on the 2 side, which is just 2 quarter notes. So again, the son clave 3-2 would sound like this. And so that rhythm sometimes is actually physically played. So like, for example, in Pan Logo, it's being played on the gongokui. It's a bell. You hear it played with the instruments that you maybe know of as the claves, 2 rosewood pieces of wood, sticks essentially. You'll hear it played on bells and wood blocks, and then sometimes it's not played at all on a percussion instrument, but it's just inferred through the rhythms and the arrangements. So, for example, in the tune Kimbara, it starts off with this 1-1 drumming pattern on the congas, a very complex and very interesting drumming pattern, but it's all based, again, around that clave. And when the singers come in, if they were listening to what the conga player, was playing, it would seem kind of confusing, but the singers are dialed into that clave pattern, and that's how it comes about. And Pancho Sanchez, he's a conguero and band leader. His tune Ikan, it's another one that has very much that clave pattern, and sometimes clave just being referred to as the key. And then the actual opening tune of our salsa set is a Frankie Ruiz tune called La Cora. And all 3 of these, they're somewhat different tunes. They feature slightly different forms, but they're all, again, associated in that conga drumming and that clave rhythmic pattern.
So we've been talking a little bit about the role of African persons in the history of music in the Americas. Talked a little bit about the slave trade. By ending in the United States, we're sort of bringing all of that history and that musical tradition home and looking at the way it has sort of developed even more so and evolved into new musical traditions that will be very identifiable to our audience, things like jazz and rock and hip-hop that sort of emerge out of all of this stuff. Can you say a little bit more about how that comes about?
Absolutely, and everything you just said has its foundation really in what we know of as the blues. So the blues, the origins of the blues are in the American Deep South. The blues are really a synthesis of African-American spirituals, narrative ballads, the work songs and field calls and howlers, call and response, the steady rhythms, a lot of things that again, have their roots back to Africa, but also other elements that connect us as far as form goes. So when you think of blues, one of the first names that comes to mind is, as I mentioned earlier in the podcast, is Bessie Smith. And she was the Empress of the Blues. She lived a really incredible life for a woman at the turn of the century. And we're going to perform Lost Your Head Blues. And one of our students is going to sing that with the pianist. And then another one of our trumpet players is going to play the role of Louis Armstrong. And this is your standard AAB form in 12 bars. And so there's a statement in a standard blues. So you say something, you say it again, and then you have a counter statement. And that's really the format of a blues. And so Lost Your Head Blues was recorded by Bessie Smith and Louis Armstrong in 1926. And it's a great example of, again, that foundation of American pop music and really the pop music that, you can probably trace everything that's on the radio today back to the blues. And that includes, of course, blues leads to jazz, and then jazz leads to a variety of other things, and then we get rock and all the commercial musics that we think of today.
So to finish things up, the program goes to New Orleans, which is in many ways sort of the city in the United States that most clearly stands at the crossroads of all of these American musical traditions. So this is a city that was settled by the French. It was governed for a time as part of the Spanish monarchy. New Orleans was also a major hub of the African slave trade. In fact, many slave owners who fled the Haitian Revolution actually resettled in and around New Orleans with their slaves, bringing so many Caribbean influences to this port city. the music of New Orleans really derives from this experience of living at a crossroads of cultures, really bringing in one place all of these influences from across the Americas we've looked at thus far, which is, again, I think a nice way to sort of wrap all of this up.
Anyone who has visited New Orleans has spent some time probably on Bourbon Street, and a tune that was written in 1955, Bourbon Street Parade, typifies the brass band or the parade band music that we think of as the New Orleans Second Line Parade. And the tune Bourbon Street Parade has become a standard tune for brass bands. The neighborhood brass bands, again, sort of like fraternal orders. You have bands from different neighborhoods throughout history. It's also become a standard in the jazz repertoire and the Dixieland repertoire. And what I mean by second line refers to the individuals that follow, dance, and really enjoy the music that is being provided in the main line or the first line of a parade. And sometimes also the second line is described of the folks who are following in a funeral. And the first line would be the deceased and then their family. And a lot of times the parades would make their way from a church and then like maybe through the neighborhood where the individual grew up and through some different key points in town that were relevant to that person's life before making their way to their final resting place. And so the second line is usually, even if the song itself is maybe in a minor key and or like A Closer Walk with Thee is something that is related, has a religious context, the music itself is still very exciting and a lot of improvisation, and really oftentimes the drummers are very funky with the way they play. And so the idea behind the second line and the roots of it, again, probably relate to the fusion of West African circle dances and the stylized dancing that took place in Congo Square, which was a area basically which you can think of almost as a park in New Orleans, where in a lot of cases slaves and then freed slaves were allowed on certain days to perform and dance and play music that was related back to Africa. And the brass band concept also it ties in with like the European military brass band tradition. So you have the instruments that would have been used pre and during and post Civil War, and those instruments again became the instruments of the jazz band. So it's really a fusion of that African dance and drumming with the European military brass band tradition, and that's the closer of our concert.
One of the things I like about this piece is that it kind of sounds very traditional, right? Very structured. It's a sound that people have probably heard of before. It's not necessarily as, almost abrasive as some of the other more recent musical traditions we were talking about, like rock. But it still has those elements of the past and still serves as the basis for people to improvise and to create new musical traditions. So this really old legacy is still alive and well in a place like New Orleans and being reproduced here in Colorado, and still serves to inspire, sort of that next generation that will, take music in new and exciting directions, create new genres. This is not by any means sort of a dead tradition. This is very much a living tradition that is continuing to evolve as it's being performed today.
So thank you for that. Yes, we do intend to pay tribute to the history of the music that we're performing, and while also, again, bringing our own spin on the music. And I think that's one of the exciting things about the music that we're playing is there's so much more depth to it than what is initially on the surface. And I want to thank Dr. Saenz from the History Department for giving us that insight and that deeper meaning and understanding of what it took for the music that we're playing to exist in the first place. So I want to thank you, Dr. Saenz.
Yeah, thank you for having me. This was enjoyable.
Well, appreciate it. And we look forward to seeing you all out on our tour and in the future. And hope you'll come and visit us all here at Adams State University.